So I think it's fair to say that for most people watching this video, the way that you will have watched movies and television shows outside of broadcast television over the years probably went something like this. VHS, DVD, and then streaming, in that order. If you're a bit younger than me, you probably missed out on having to deal with VHS tapes, and I'm sure there's some of you out there who probably had laserdisc or Blu-ray, but for most people, VHS, DVD, streaming. Growing up, pretty much everyone that I knew and their family had VHS and then DVD. I don't think I knew anyone that had Betamax or Laserdisc. And for what it's worth, my journey went something like this. VHS, DVD, streaming, then Blu-ray, and then finally 4K UHD. 4K UHD mostly because I don't like money. Although that's not the full story, because for a brief period in the early 2000s, a lot of the video discs that I was being bought were not DVDs, as you might assume, but were in fact video CDs. Or VCDs, as I'll be referring to them in this video. And despite the fact that I remember them quite well, pretty much no one that I've spoken to seems to remember them, and going online, you'd probably be convinced that these things just didn't exist, given that they never get brought up and they've largely been forgotten. Which is a little bit strange because the underlying technology certainly hasn't been forgotten, and that is the trusty audio CD. So I guess let's start all the way at the beginning, back in, or at least the beginning for me, which is roughly 2003-ish, because by the time I was being bought these discs, the format itself was already about a decade old, and apart from a few places, it was already a format that had been superseded and it was already out the door. The format itself actually originates about a decade earlier in 1993. It was a joint collaboration, or at least a joint IP collaboration, between JVC, Sony, Philips and Matsushita, with the goal of bringing video to the compact disc format. The same compact disc, which by that time was already about a decade old at that point, but up until then it was only used for storing music or as a way to store data in the form of a CD-ROM. Now of course VCDs weren't the first attempt to produce a disc format video. There was a short-lived and somewhat confusingly named CD video, and of course there was the much more known Laserdisc. And Philips and Sony and JVC and Matsushita were really banking on the new compact video CD being the new winner in the format wars. Sony especially after the defeat of Betamax, which they developed, to the VHS, which they did not develop, and as a result, they didn't get any royalties for the production of the VHS tape. If the VCD worked and it took off, Sony would get a slice of the pie every time a VCD was sold, and they'd have control of the format itself. Now the big breakthrough and the biggest difference between VCDs and CD video and Laserdisc was the fact that Laserdisc and CD video were both analog formats, whereas VCDs, they were all digital. All the data is stored as ones and zeros, which is no different to how it was on a regular CD. And what allowed it all to work was the development of the MPEG-1 video standard. Now MPEG-1 was not the first digital video standard, but it was probably the first digital video standard that was marketed towards the consumer. And through it, analog video could be converted into digital information that could then be stored on a compact disc. Now unlike a lot of modern video standards, MPEG-1 is a little bit weird because it is a constant bitrate standard, whereas modern standards use a variable bitrate. So what this effectively means is that the amount of data that is used for video changes depending on how much data is needed for the scene. In slow scenes where not a whole lot of stuff is happening, you don't need as much data to display the information as you would need in a fast scene where a lot of stuff is happening. And it's a very smart way of cutting down on data and saving that spare space for when you actually need it. But MPEG-1 is a constant. The audio and the video is always being output at 1.5 megabits per second. Although in fairness, it's not so much different to a regular audio CD, which will output data at 1.4 megabits per second. Yeah, they're a little bit different. And the difference is deliberate. The reason for it is to give the VCD a bit more space to work. The engineers, when designing this, cut down on the amount of space that would normally be used for error correction. It still has error correction, but just a lot less of it, and that small amount of space was then given to the audio and the video data. And from memory, you could definitely tell that this thing had less error correction than a regular CD. These things, they would freeze like crazy, and that's simply because they had less error correction and they had more data that the error correction had to support. I mean, back in the day, you could always tell if you're running a VCD or a DVD. One, because the audio and the video were worse, and B, because it would freeze all the time. With that said though, the engineers probably made the right call in sacrificing that error correction because they really had a tough job when they were coming up with the VCD standard. For one, you're still dealing with a standard CD. The underlying technology is exactly the same, and as a result, you only have about 700 megabytes of storage to deal with. But in the grand scheme of things, 100 kilobytes per second extra of data is not going to be game changing. VCDs were an incredibly limited format, and as you'll see in a minute, they had to take a lot of compromises to make this thing work. Which I guess brings me to showing you the VCD working, which as it turns out was a lot more difficult than I initially planned it to be. First of all, I tried my Panasonic 4K Blu-ray player. I mean, it can play anything and everything, and it can even play regular CDs. But apparently the one thing that it won't play is VCDs. Alright then, let me try my old DVD player, which was my Xbox 360. And despite it being a console from 2005, I mean obviously not this one, but the underlying technology is from 2005, but even still, it did not play VCDs. Alright then, let's try the PS2. I mean the PS2 famously was the go-to DVD player for millions of people. It's from the year 2000, I mean surely it has to play VCDs. I mean Sony, who developed the VCD, also developed the PS2. But as it turns out, no, it will not play VCDs. I mean, I had to get an old DVD player to get this thing to actually work. And the results are...
Storm Norman's making his weekly inspection. Spent half of it on the phone.
Rough. I mean, I had low expectations, but I just forgot just how bad these VCDs used to be. I mean, it looks pretty terrible. And if you think I'm being harsh, I mean, this is coming from a guy who occasionally still watches VHS tapes. I mean, if it can't even compete with VHS tapes, you know this format is going to have issues. I mean, obviously we can't expect all that much from a format that is over 30 years old at this point, but there's only so much that 1.5 megabits per second of audio and video can do. I mean, these days with modern compression algorithms, you could get a much more usable video at only 1.5 megabits per second, but you really can't expect all that much from a 30-year-old data standard. However, another reason why it looks so rough is that it's not even playing at standard definition. To get this thing to work, they had to cut standard definition in half, which is a quarter of the data of standard definition. So the file is only 352 pixels wide by 288 pixels high, 240p for NTSC discs. And it's probably very obvious, but it's only 4:3 aspect ratio only. I doubt it has enough data to handle the extra data needed for 16:9 content. And in fairness to it, back when this thing was developed, pretty much every television was a 4:3. But even still, 288p, 240p, whatever you were using, NTSC or PAL, it is literally worse than the signal that you would get from broadcast television. It's pretty much on par with VHS, which is what this thing was supposed to be going up against. And even though the resolution, if you want to call it that, was the same as a VHS, the actual picture that you would get from it was, in my opinion, slightly worse than a VHS. And there's no point in me trying to compare it to a laserdisc, mostly because I don't own any laserdiscs, and the players are incredibly expensive these days, and in any event, the laserdisc was a high resolution and a premium product. What these things were really targeted at was the VHS, and at least to me, I think the VHS looks a lot better. And whilst it obviously can't beat it on image quality, VCDs offer a ton of improvements compared to the VHS. And the biggest one for me, at least for me as a kid, was the fact that you didn't have to rewind it when you got to the end of the tape, or the disc. And as well as that, VCDs also had chapters, so there was no need to wind forwards and backwards on the videotape until you found the part that you were looking for, which in turn would also wear out the tape over time. VCDs are obviously bred by a laser, and so as long as they were kept mostly dust and scratch free, the quality of a 25-year-old disc would be just as good as the first time that it was played. And in this case, the quality is just as good, or should I say just as bad now, as it was 25 years ago. And of course, unlike a video cassette, VCDs take up pretty much no space at all, and if you're like me and you discarded the packaging, you'd put it in one of these big CD albums, and you could have about 100 CDs in the same volume as maybe 3 or 4 video cassettes. More importantly, for the sake of preservation, VCDs, unlike VHS tapes, don't go mouldy if you store them incorrectly. I've had a lot of VHS tapes unfortunately go bad due to improper storage over the years, and unfortunately once that happens, there's not a whole lot that you can do to save the VHS tape unless you send it out to be professionally restored. And it probably isn't too shocking to learn that that is something that I'm not going to be doing. The VCDs, however, except for a few scratches which can be polished out, they have held up really well, considering that most of them are probably about 25 years old at this point. And whilst this is more of a manufacturing side thing, once all the processes were really dialed in and making them was really mainstream, the price for a VCD would eventually become a lot cheaper than a VHS tape. A videotape requires a hard case with several interlocking pieces and a set of sprockets to wind the tape. And then of course you need the 200 plus meters of magnetic tape, and then you need to put the data on that tape. A disc, on the other hand, whilst it's still an incredibly complex piece of kit, is still, at the end of the day, just an injection molded piece of plastic. Obviously incredibly complex things to make, but once it was all dialed in, making them was a lot easier and a lot cheaper. Of course though, there are still tons of limitations with VCDs. For one, subtitle tracks. On modern DVDs and Blu-rays, the subtitle tracks are loadable, but with the VCDs on the other hand, that really wasn't a thing. With that said, most discs do seem to have subtitles. They're just baked into the video file and you can't turn them off. Now that is great if they're in your language, this is in English, so that works fine for me. But a lot of my VCDs have subtitle tracks that are in Chinese, Vietnamese, Thai or Khmer, and they're generally not usable for me. And also from what I can gather, one audio track only. Most DVDs and Blu-rays have multiple audio tracks so you can select different languages, but with VCDs, one audio track only. Thankfully though, it was in stereo sound. Now from what I've read online, some discs would be very smart and they'd split 2 different languages on the 2 audio tracks. So what you could have was 2 mono soundtracks playing in 2 different languages, and by switching between them, you could have one language or the other. I don't have any discs like that, but if they do exist, that is pretty smart thinking. So at this point, I think it's fair to say that whilst the VCD was not perfect, it certainly did offer quite a few advantages compared to the older VHS. Which really begs the question, why didn't it work? Why didn't it take over, and why wasn't it the dominant format until DVD? Because I can definitely promise you that for most people in the early 2000s, what they did was they moved directly from VHS to DVD, skipping over VCD entirely, and pretty much cementing this as a forgotten format. And the reason for it obviously comes down to several different reasons. The big one obviously being that VHS was the dominant format, and it had been the dominant format for a very long time, and it just wasn't a big enough improvement to dethrone it. Most people at that point already owned VCRs, and VCRs were obviously a very expensive piece of tech at the time, and the reality was very few people were going to spend the hundreds of dollars to buy the player and replace all their media, especially when the new media in question was going to look worse than the one that it was replacing, and when it was released, very few titles were available in the VCD format. It also really didn't help that VCDs were, at the end of the day, CDs. Unlike a DVD which can store 4.7 gigabytes of information, CDs only have about 700 megabytes of data to play around with. Now that's more than fine for storing 80 minutes of uncompressed audio, because most albums are generally going to be well below that, but movies are generally going to be a lot longer than 80 minutes. And because VCDs could only store about 80 minutes of audio and video, most movies would have to be split into 2 parts, with the split usually occurring about halfway through the movie. Now if you had a fancy multi-disc player, changing from disc A to B would be pretty easy and straightforward, but I never had one of those, so I had to change the discs manually. Now obviously, it's not a big task. Doing it would probably take about a minute, but considering that most movies could be stored on one VHS tape, made the selling point of VCDs just that little bit harder. And of course, that also means that you now have 2 discs which you now need to keep track of and protect. And considering that I have quite a few incomplete sets, shows that that was something that I was not able to do. Either that or those discs got really scratched beyond repair. Now yes, double-sided discs are and were a thing, and they probably could have solved the whole having to need 2 different discs to store one movie. But the thing is, these things are incredibly rare. I only have a few of them and they are pretty easy to scratch. I mean, they're interesting, but I am glad that these things weren't the norm. Plus, I mean, who wouldn't want to miss any of that beautiful disc artwork? And also, just to touch on a topic that we talked about earlier, there being less error correction on these discs compared to a normal CD. You know, that means there's more data that you need to support and less error correction to support it if something goes wrong, which means that these things would freeze all the time if there were even small amounts of scratches on the discs. At least with a VHS tape, if a section is scratched or damaged, it at least goes past it until the data becomes good and then it just goes from there. You know, there's no freezing and lagging or skipping. Now, another reason why the VCD was killed off, ironically, came from the movie studios themselves. The same movie studios that the VCD was developed for. And the reason for that is VCDs didn't have any form of copy protection built into them. Now, that wasn't going to be a problem when the VCD and the CD standard was being written up, but that would quickly become a problem once everyone got personal home computers and when CDRs and disc burners would become mainstream and a lot cheaper. With the VCD, the data is just sort of there. So all you have to do is copy and paste the data to your hard drive, then you drop in a blank CDR disk, you burn it, and now you have a new copy of whatever you copied. It sounds stupidly simple, but it was that simple. All that effectively means is that you only have to buy one legit copy, or you can simply download all the files. You can then burn it to a blank CDR, and you will have 10, 15, 20 copies, if you want, of usable VCDs. It is as simple as that. Now, obviously, in hindsight, it is easy to say that they should have known this. They should have known that VCDs should have some form of copy protection. But when the standards were being written back in the early 90s, no one really understood that in a few years' time, CDRs and CDR burners would become incredibly cheap enough for regular people to buy them, and making bootleg copies would be so easy. And as a result, a whole industry of bootleg copies simply exploded, especially in Southeast Asia, costing the studios untold hundreds of millions of dollars, something that they were obviously not very happy with. And that's where pretty much all of my VCDs came from. Now, I'm sure a few of these were legit, but most of them were definitely not. But really, at least on the quality side, it really didn't matter. Because you're simply copying ones and zeros, the quality of a bootleg, or at least the quality of the video of a bootleg, is going to be just as good as the original legit copy. With that said though, I do use the term quality pretty loosely. And the studios definitely are not going to be happy with me. Because as well as people in Asia making bootlegs, this one here is my bootleg. This is one that I burnt up tonight, simply because the original VCD, which was also a bootleg, the original VCD was so scratched up, and I don't have any polishing compound, that I had to go and put it in my Blu-ray drive in my computer. I think the smaller laser can read it a lot better. I had to go rip all the files from that disc, burn it onto this disc to get a usable file that I could play on the television behind me. It was absurdly easy to do. Literally Control-C, the files onto my hard drive, and then put in a blank DVD-R, and then put all the data back onto it. It was so easy, and I was probably done in about 10 minutes. You know, I know that, you now know that, and the studios, they definitely knew that. It was costing them money, and they needed to find a solution, which they did in the form of the DVD. In 1996, the DVD standard was born, and that is really what killed the VCD. Now, importantly for the movie studios, it had copy protection built into the standard itself. Now, eventually, it would be cracked, allowing for a new generation of bootleg DVDs, but most importantly, it stops you from simply Control-C'ing and then Control-V'ing all the data onto a blank DVD-R. And on the same topic, as well as having the copy protection, the studios also loved the DVD format because it introduced a very sneaky and very frustrating feature which we all know as region locking. Now essentially it is simply just a way to control how a DVD was released and distributed across different markets, ensuring that DVDs purchased from a distributor in one region, such as England, which is region 2, or China, which is region 6, wouldn't be able to play on an Australian DVD player, which was region 4. It would only load region 4 DVDs, which would be sold in Australia. Now officially the reason for it is so that a distributor who has paid for the rights to sell a DVD in a certain region is getting paid by people who are using that DVD in that region. For example, Village Roadshow Films is a big distributor in Australia, but the big problem is a lot of Australian discs were pretty expensive at the time. But what the region locking would ensure is that it would stop you from simply going to another country where the disc might be cheaper, buy the disc there and simply bring it back. It would be a different region and you wouldn't be able to play it on a regular player. Now on one hand I guess sort of fair enough, but it really didn't help that Australia was seemingly last on the release of content for no reason. I mean, there were times where I'd be waiting easily half a year or longer for a DVD release to be released in Australia when it was already released months beforehand in Europe or the Americas. And for some things, we didn't get a release full stop. And because of that, and because of the region locking, you couldn't simply just buy a disc from the UK and get it shipped over. Different region, and those discs to this day won't play in my player. I mean, thank God for the team behind VLC Player, because VLC Player is able to bypass the DRM and the region locking and play any disc, irrespective of whether it does or does not have region locking. More importantly though for the consumer, was that generational leap that everyone was looking for, offering capabilities far beyond what VHS could offer. I mean, pretty much every way that you cut it, the DVD was superior in every single way. The big one obviously compared to a VCD was the capacity of a DVD. 4.7 gigabytes of storage to work with on a single layer DVD. That's almost 7 times the capacity of a CD. And most importantly, higher quality video and higher bit rates. On a DVD, the maximum bit rate that you can get is about 10 megabits per second, compared to the 1.5 megabits per second that we were getting on a VCD. And that's a variable bit rate, thanks to the new MPEG-2 standard. With that said though, most scenes hover at around about the 4 to 5 megabits per second mark, because in part, MPEG-2 is a far more efficient standard than MPEG-1, but only intense action scenes really required that extra bandwidth that the DVD standard could offer. And most importantly, this was proper standard definition video, not the chopped in half standard that was used by the VCD. And the image quality itself, compared to VHS, VCD and laserdisc, was a lot better on the DVD. Better compression, better colours and better dynamic range. And as well as that, DVDs also featured multi-track audio, not just regular stereo that you'd find on most formats beforehand. DVD could do 5.1 audio and that is a big advantage. The audio itself is still pretty compressed, but it's a huge step up from the audio that we were getting before. And more importantly, up to 8 audio tracks could be selected. So you could have English plus 7 other languages. And as well as that, selectable subtitle tracks also were a thing. It just means that the subtitles aren't permanently hard-coded into the frame, taking up a huge chunk of the screen. And whilst it wasn't the first format to achieve this, DVDs were thankfully 16:9 content, which VCDs definitely weren't. Also, it seems pretty trivial, but menus were a thing on DVDs, whereas I'm not sure that they're possible with VCDs. At least none of the VCDs that I have any menus. When you pod them into the player, they simply boot up and start playing. With DVDs, you got scene selection, you got special features. On some DVDs, you actually got games. So that was a huge step up and a big marketing opportunity for a lot of the studios. So with all those advantages, it's obviously not too hard to imagine why the DVD took off and it eventually won the format war. Yes, DVDs were a lot more to produce than regular CDs, but that wouldn't be enough to save the VCD format. And if you ask me, I think the final nail in the coffin was... It was the PS2. It was the PS2. 160 million of these units sold, and famously, at launch, it was even cheaper than a lot of dedicated DVD players. A lot of people bought this solely to use as a DVD player, and like I said before, Sony, even though they helped develop the VCD format, they dropped support of the VCD for the PS2, with the hope that it would force people into using DVDs. DVDs with copy protection and DRM, and also on a side note, the PS2 also famous for having its own DRM features and anti-piracy, so you couldn't simply buy a bootleg PS2 game unless you had loaded in special software to let that game play. Very sneaky, Sony. So there you go, not even a decade old at that point, and Sony was already killing off their own format. I should follow it up by saying that most DVD players, even DVD players that you can buy today, still support VCDs. And I think with Sony really pulling the plug, that was probably the end, or signalling the end, for the VCD format. That is, however, unless you grew up in Southeast Asia, because for a longer period of time in the early 2000s, VCDs were a much bigger thing than they were in the rest of the world. Now obviously it will depend on which country specifically and which period of time and, you know, how rich and how developing the country was, but VCDs were definitely a big thing for a while. And a lot of that's owing to the fact that most households didn't have VCRs in the 90s. Videotape in general is a lot less common in Asia. That's down to A, VCRs were incredibly expensive at the time, and B, because of the humidity, they would go mouldy a lot more quickly if they weren't stored correctly. So when people started buying CD and DVD players, CDs and VCDs were quick to follow. CDRs were a lot cheaper than DVDs and DVDRs, so it's no surprise that these stuck around for a lot longer than, you know, they did in the rest of the world. I mean, even to this day, buying a pack of blank CDRs is a lot cheaper than buying a pack of blank DVDRs. And back in the early 2000s, that price difference would have been even bigger. And as a result, these things, they were everywhere, and that's where these things came from. But of course, time will come for us all, and by the mid to late 2000s, I can't seem to remember any VCDs being sold. All of the bootleg copies that I was being bought were, you know, knockoff DVDRs, and in the past 10 years, time came for those stores as well. I mean, 20 years ago in Hong Kong or Thailand or Cambodia, those knockoff DVD stores, they were everywhere. But if you go there today, you'd be hard pressed to find one of those stores. But that is a story for another time. A story that definitely won't be brought to you on a VCD. And with that, thank you very much for watching.